All right, this lecture is part 2 of a series called Traveling Together Through Shakespeare's Italy. Part 1, if you want to see it, is on YouTube, and it describes how to convince my husband, Rich, a lawyer and a historian, that Will of Stratford could not have written Shakespeare's works. We took a bard-targeted tour of northern Italy. We traced Edward de Vere, 17th Earl of Oxford's 1575 journey through Milan, Padua, Verona, Mantua, and Sabagnetta to Venice, guided by the Northern Italian plays, Richard Rowe's Shakespeare's travels in Italy, and my historical research, mostly in Italian. Experiencing the Northern Italian plays' precise geographic and historical details in their settings convinced Rich that the bard had been there personally and spoke excellent Italian. Since Will of Stratford never left England, and no one thinks he spoke Italian, Rich agreed finally that Will could not be the bard, but he remained unconvinced that Oxford was. Convincing Rich of anything is never easy. I needed a new game plan. Among the mysteries about Oxford is why he left Venice soon after his arrival, and where he was between late May and September 23rd, 1575, when Clementi Perrette, Oxford's servant and a spy for Oxford's father-in-law, William Cecil, Lord Burleigh, wrote Burleigh that Oxford had returned to Venice from Genoa, having hurt his knee traveling in a Venetian galley. 15 years later, a claim surfaced that Oxford had been in Palermo, but for about 130 days in 1575, Oxford vanished. The highly connected English spy network at home and abroad found no trace. Jason Bourne had nothing on Oxford. Maybe I could figure out where Oxford likely was for those 130 days. By following his footprints, we might find ourselves in the southern Italian plays' locations. There, geographic and historical details might match the plays enough in ways that only an eyewitness would know. If his journey proved unique, maybe all my circumstantial and historical evidence would convince Rich that Oxford alone had personally experienced what the bard wrote into the plays, and thus that Oxford was the bard. Before we left, I did enough research to propose this theory to Rich. First, that Oxford fled the city of Venice shortly after his arrival, sailing east and then south along the western Adriatic coast between modern Trieste and Montenegro, then part of the Venetian Republic. Strewn along that coast are idyllic islands secured by the heavily fortified Venetian cities of Trieste, which is now split Croatia, and Kotor, Montenegro, modern, and the Republic of Ragusa, which is now Dubrovnik, Croatia. That entire area, from the Istrian Peninsula to the modern Albanian and Greek border, was the former Roman province of Illyricum, or Illyria. Sailing further south along Illyria's coast to Butrothum, now Butrint, Albania, Oxford faced a decision. Rich and I had sailed from Venice to Butrint, but what was news to Rich was that the bard set 2 plays, The Winter's Tale and Twelfth Night, in Illyria. Well read in ancient Greek and Latin, from Butrint, Oxford could have gone east to Greece or west towards Sicily. He chose, and Shakespeare's works reflect the second part of the voyage described by Virgil in 9,896 lines of dactylic hexameter, the Aeneid. Well known to Latin students, the Aeneid describes the legendary Trojan warrior's Aeneas' epic voyage, shown on this map, from the fall of Troy in modern Turkey, around the Greek Peloponnese to Butrint, and then along Italy's foot, the Sicilian coast, detouring to Carthage, which is now Tunis, Tunisia, through the Aeolian Islands, which include Vulcano, landing on Italy's west coast at Cuma near Naples, and ultimately to Rome. Oxford sailed further north to Genoa. Had Oxford or the bard pleasure cruised around the Italian peninsula, the shorter route, hugging the Italian shore, would make sense, and the plays would reflect Ravenna or Brindisi's details, for example, but they do not. Had the bard traced Aeneas's entire journey using the Aeneid's text alone, the plays would include details of the beginning of Aeneas's journey between Troy and Butrint, and the final section between Sicily and Rome, but they do not. Instead, the plays reflect the unique combination of one, a voyage from Venice along the Illyrian coast to Butrint, and two, from Butrint, tracing only the Sicilian sections of the Aeneid. Have you ever wondered why the plays are set in certain Italian cities, but not others? I asked Rich. Why Padua, but not Bologna? Why Verona, but not Forlì? Why Palermo, but not Naples? Or why Croatian and Albanian territories appear in Twelfth Night, Comedy of Errors, and Winter's Tale? Rich had no idea. Maybe those are the only places Oxford could go in 1575, I said. Maybe that summer, Oxford made the identical voyage the bard must have made to write the Southern Italian plays. Maybe, said Rich, and we set out for Italy. While in Paris in March, Oxford received introductory letters to the Venetian state from the Venetian ambassador to France, Giovanni Morosini, enabling him to travel through northern Italy. When Oxford first arrived in Venice in May 1575, there was no Venetian ambassador to England. By the time he departed for England a year later, the Venetian Signoria had appointed one. Valentine Dale, England's ambassador to France, expressed great satisfaction at that intelligence, indicating that one likely reason Oxford went to Venice was to establish diplomatic relations with the Venetians. But less than a month after his initial arrival, he left suddenly because Venice and all of Italy suffered virulent plague in the summer of 1575. My first lecture discussed the plague in Milan. Rich was no less intrigued by plague in Venice, a maritime trading powerhouse set on dozens of islands where 50,000 people, or 28% of the population, died in that one outbreak. All Venice went into lockdown. Incoming passengers and ships were quarantined. Carnivale was canceled. Churches closed their doors. The city blockaded at the Rialto Bridge. The population forced to isolate in their homes. Checkpoints encircled the lagoon. Health permits, called bollettini or fedi di sanità, were issued to those permitted to travel. Does that sound familiar? Like Milan, Venice created lazaretti outside the city on the outer lagoon's islands. The Lazaretto Vecchio housed 10,000 plague victims. Rocco Benedetti described it as hell itself, the air full of foul smells and the groans and cries of the dying left behind to fend for themselves. The Lazaretto Nuovo, not much better, warehoused incoming goods, sailors, passengers, and plague victims' relatives in a former monastery. Recent excavations on Lazaretto Vecchio unearthed mass graves. Thousands of skeletons lie beneath the island's meadows. Oxford vanished when he left Venice, partially to free himself of burly spies. Religious tensions made Elizabethan England a dangerous place, rife with spies. Burleigh was the government's spin master, but he also ran an impressive spy network. He sent Thomas Winterbark to report back on his own son, Thomas, during his continental tour, and did the same to 25-year-old Oxford, who knew and did not like that his father-in-law was closely following his movements and conversations. Add their sharp exchange of letters about Oxford's wife, Anne, delivering a bastard daughter, the subject of another of my YouTube lectures, and you will understand why Oxford wanted to elude Burleigh spies. Here are some of the spies Burleigh employed and or badgered for information about Oxford on the continent. There are doubtlessly others whose names we will never know. An excellent anonymous and pseudonymous playwright, poet, songwriter, and pamphleteer, Oxford regularly assumed different personae and pseudonyms to publish his work. Contemporary eyewitnesses on the continent attest to his lifelong habit of disappearing. Burleigh attached the gumshoe William Lewin to Oxford's initial party bound for Paris. Lewin sent Burghley regular secret reports from Paris and Strasbourg, where Oxford studied with the aged Johann Sturm, also Burghley's informant. Oxford whittled down his traveling companions in Paris and had been feeding Lewin alternate travel plans for weeks. Greece, Italy, Constantinople. Oh no. On April 26, 1575, Oxford launched his getaway, dumping Lewin in Strasbourg in the middle of the night. He left no forwarding address. Frantic, Lewin wrote Burghley excuses for having lost Oxford. A furious Burghley wrote back repeatedly demanding that Lewin contact Burghley's spy network for answers. Lewin writes on July 4 from Strasbourg, I think he has either not tarried long in Italy, lest there should be any mention of his trip to Constantinople, he be recalled by the prince. Or, if he is in Italy, he wants his Italian sojourn to be as concealed from all people as possible, either for the same reason, or he delights in this very thing, his ability to hide. Another Burghley spy, Francis Pato, trying and failing to meet Oxford in Milan, ostensibly to show him a genealogical chart meant for the Queen, confirmed that Oxford traveled unrecognized. My meaning was to have shown the designment to my Lord of Oxford if he had passed this way, visible to any English eye, as he did not. So where did Oxford go and how? With travel blocked at the Alpine passes and Milan and cities to the west infested by plague, a well-known Protestant earl and great Lord Chamberlain of England, bearing diplomatic letters from the excommunicated Queen Elizabeth, arch-enemy to Philip II of Spain and the Pope, had few options. 1575 Italy was not a country, but an assemblage of independently ruled and disproportionately influential city-states. The Republic of Venice included Mantua, Padua, Bergamo, and Verona. Oxford possessed Morosini's letters to travel there, and he did. Likewise, in the republics of Florence, Siena, and Genoa, nestled up against Montferrat, ruled by his friend Guglielmo Gonzaga, Duke of Mantua and Duke of Montferrat. All these places appear in the northern Italian plays. The Papal States included not only Rome, but part of the Tyrrhenian and half the Adriatic coasts, and Bologna, Ravenna, and Ancona. Oxford orated at the University of Padua, but not at the more prestigious University of Bologna, because Bologna was in the Papal States. None of the Papal State cities appear in the plays except ancient Rome, but like a stage set, not early modern Rome. Sicily contains excellent ruins of large Roman cities, as we will see. The Kingdom of Naples blanketed the peninsula's entire lower half and was ruled by Spain, as with the Duchy of Milan, which Oxford wrote he dared not even pass by. Benedict Spinola's March 23, 1576 letter to Burghley, in Italian, stating that Oxford did not take up the 1,800 scudi Spinola left for him in Naples, or monies he left in other Italian cities, further evidences that Oxford, who always needed money, avoided certain cities, including Naples. The play's references to Naples only identify Neapolitan rulers. One observation in Othello notes the nasal Neapolitan accent, a well-known fact, since Boccaccio poked fun at it in his widely read 1339 Epistola Napolitana. With all inbound galleys, ferries, and ships quarantined, Oxford must have scrambled at great personal expense to get any vessel out of Venice. This would be no pleasure cruise. In 1563, he had survived both 16th century London's worst plague, in which over 20,000 people perished in 7 months, and his half-sister Catherine's lawsuit claiming that he was illegitimate. Now, alone in Venice, with major Italian cities and the Alpine passes in lockdown, and Edward Windsor, Catherine's husband, 5 months cold in his Venetian grave, Oxford assessed his assets and limited options for preserving his own life. 1. Diplomatic letters identifying him as an English Protestant earl, particularly favored by the Queen. While serving his diplomatic purposes, these papers also required that he avoid hostile, dangerous swaths of the Italian peninsula, subject to the Pope, the Spanish, and Barbary pirates. 2. A desire to avoid his father-in-law's spies and anyone else who might recognize him. 3. Travel letters for the Venetian territories. 4. A marvel of a mind steeped in classic literature, including Virgil. And 5. Money, or at least credit. Although he had to return to Venice to complete his diplomatic mission, Oxford needed to leave Venice immediately, at least for the summer, until the plague subsided. His only option was to sail east into the Venetian territories, along the sparsely populated Illyrian coast, certainly not south along the densely populated coast of the Papal States and the Kingdom of Naples. The Winter's Tale, first published in the First Folio, has a mirror twin predecessor written by a mirror twin author, Pandosto, The Triumph of Time by Robert Greene, published in 1588. To the evidence that Oxford used the pseudonym Robert Greene just prior to William Shakespeare, add that this first version of his mea culpa was published the same year Anne Cecil was entombed in her enormous Westminster Abbey monument. Realizing that Pandosto is Oxford's first draft for Winter's Tale reveals much about his travels and the bard's creative processes. In Pandosto, the two kingdoms are reversed. Pandosto opens in a Bohemian palace, not Sicily's Palazzo Normani. The abandoned daughter grows up with shepherds in Sicily, not in Bohemia. Jealous Sicilian king Leontes is Bohemia's king Pandosto. Bohemia's king Polynixes is Sicilian king Aegisthus. Pandosto's queen really dies and is wrapped in lead in a rich and famous tomb with her dead son. Perhaps little Lord Bulbeck also lies in Anne Cecil's tomb. The plots are nearly identical. Stratfordians make a comedy of geographic errors about the Illyrian coast. Rowe and the author of both Pandosto and Winter's Tale correctly state that historical Bohemia, a landlocked kingdom now in the Czech Republic, had an Adriatic coast in Illyria for 9 years. Between 1269 and 1278, Ottokar II, king of Bohemia, who appears in Dante's Purgatorio, ruled both Bohemia's neighbor Carinthia and Carinthia's neighbor Carinola, where the Bay of Panzano's sandy, or as the bard calls it, desert beach, borders the Gulf of Trieste. Panzano itself is labeled Villaggio di Pescatore, or a fishing village, on modern maps. In the 16th century, wild animals inhabiting its dunes, which may be why Antigonus's famous heir followed by a bear in Winter's Tale, and Pandosto's meticulous recitation of wild grasses, flowers, and trees specific to the Mediterranean, could be Oxford's eyewitness account. Today, two special areas of conservation and protection encompass the Bay of Panzano. However, Rowe identified the wrong Oracle of Apollo, which proclaims the queen's innocence and the king's fate. Instead of landlocked Delphi, Pandosto and Winter's Tale both correctly name Apollo's oracle on the island of Delphos in the Cyclades near Mykonos. In the early 17th century, the island famous in antiquity as Delos, the sacred birthplace of Apollo, was commonly known as Delphos, and Apollo's temple and massive statue were both still visible there then. Landlocked Delphi is on the Greek mainland, southwest of Mount Parnassus. But guess who else sailed to Delphos to consult Apollo's oracle? Compare Aeneas's description of Delphos to Cleomenes and Dion's from the Winter's Tale. The nearly identical descriptions of the island, Apollo's oracle, the priest's clothing, the frightening dramatic proclamations make it clear that the bard was copying Virgil's description of the island of Delphos with its temple of Apollo, not landlocked Delphi. No need to ride 50 miles round trip into Sicily's interior, as Rowe concludes, to see the unfinished temple on Segestus' lonely hill, when Virgil offered a ready-made description, and Agrigento lay on Sicily's coast. But Sicily was Spanish through the crown of Aragon, like Naples and Milan, my history nerd husband pressed me. Yes, but Sicily was different. Due to its central Mediterranean location, before the Spanish, Sicily had been ruled in turn by the Phoenicians, the Greeks, the Carthaginians, the Romans, the Goths, the Byzantines, the Arabs, the Normans, the French, and its royal bloodline was partly English. To survive the next invasion, Sicilians tolerated coterminous cultures, languages, laws, religions, races, even simultaneous kings. During the kingdom of the two Sicilies, Charles ruled from Naples, and Peter, the historical Sicilian king, when Bohemia had a seacoast, from Palermo. Its architecture, food, culture, and language have always been a fusion. In the 5 years before Oxford arrived, the Venetians lost Cyprus to the Turks, the Holy League retaliated at Lepanto, and Philip ordered his brother Don Juan of Austria back to Messina. But in 1574, Barbary pirates raided Palermo's outskirts, and the Turks captured Tunis from Don Juan. Disgusted, Philip cut his losses in the Mediterranean and redeployed Juan to conquer the lowlands and England, leaving 1575 Sicily abandoned, ungoverned, and lawless. If you could avoid the cities with plague, the brigands, and the pirates, Sicily, with its smaller coastal towns, was a good place for a Protestant English earl to ride out the summer pestilence, unrecognized. Messina, the setting for Much Ado About Nothing, sits across narrow straits from Calabria. Rowe's attribution of the Claudio hero storyline to Matteo Bandolello's 1554 novella is correct. Boccacio's seduction of Margaret, impersonating her mistress Hero in front of Claudio, is based on Ludovico Ariosto's Orlando Furioso. It is clear the bard used multiple Italian sources. Half of Messina's population died in the 1575 plague. And it had an English consul, whom Oxford wanted to avoid, like the plague. Rowe tried hard to pin the bard's presence there on geographic clues. Rich and I could confirm none of them, nor their singularity to Messina. Thus, with the virulent plague and the English consul, we concluded that Oxford likely avoided Messina. Rowe's example of pleached arbors or alleys were not unique to Messina, being common in Italian and French gardens from late medieval times. Henry Binnemann's 1577 book, The Gardener's Labyrinth, shows they existed in Elizabethan England. As the Messina governor's daughter, Hero should marry Claudio in her own parish church. But Rowe identified Chiesa San Giovanni Battista Detto du Fiorentini, 15 blocks from where he placed her home. Rowe's reasons were that Claudio was Florentine, the church had been built on top of the ancient temple of Ercole Monteclo, and Boccaccio says the couple married in a temple. But Don Pedro and Ursula called the wedding location a church. My Italian research showed that the remains of the temple of Ercole Monteclo were discovered after Rowe's death under the intersection of Via Cardenes and Via Primo Settembre. The Church of San Giovanni Battista, destroyed completely in the 17th century, had incorporated traces of the temple into its walls. Rowe admitted the church's name did not include Detto du Fiorentini until 1580, 4 years after Oxford left Italy. Even if he had been in Messina, Oxford would not have known that church was associated with Florentines. The cemetery with family tombs outside Messina, where Rowe pins Hero's burial, is not unique to Messina. Such cemeteries are common in coastal Italy, indeed, any place with a high water table. New Orleans has several. The first folio specifies no location, only that the scene requires tapers or candles. But in Rose's defense, finding traces of 16th century Messina is nearly impossible because of two earthquakes. The most powerful in Italian history hit Messina with a tsunami in 1693. The second, in 1908, destroyed everything the first one left. None of the bard's plays are set here, but Taormina, cantilevered over Sicily's eastern coast, is breathtaking. From its Greek theater, the audience can enjoy both the play and postcard perfect views of Etna. In Oxford's time, the theater likely resembled this 19th century photograph. Any of Sicily's semicircular theaters might have inspired the 1576 design of the theater in Shoreditch, a short walk from Oxford's Fisher's Folly and his King's Place, which was later rebuilt into the Globe Theater. Aeneas braved Taormina's cave where the Cyclops dwell, so perhaps Oxford checked it out. Etna's eruptions have closed Sicily's main airport, Catania, several times this year, and its volcanic soil produces excellent wine. The gods live still on Sicily. 6 characters in the Comedy of Errors set in Ephesus in modern Turkey originally hailed from Siracusa on Sicily's southeast coast. They were separated in a shipwreck in the Adriatic between Siracusa and Epidamnium, also called Epidamnos, now Dores, Albania, on the Illyrian coast. Plautus, whom Oxford read, also set Errors' source in these 2 cities. During our 2019 Sicilian Odyssey, I told Rich I was certain the bard had visited Siracusa and its ancient island fortress, Ortigia, although Rose's 2011 book did not discuss them or the play. As I was preparing this lecture, the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship newsletter published, courtesy of Michael Delahoyd, Rose's unpublished manuscript on Errors, Siracusa, and Epidamnium. Aeneas did not visit Ortigia and Syracusa's harbor, but as we stood there, Rich told me how the Athenian fleet sank there during the Peloponnesian War. Today, in Ortigia's ancient marketplace, a kaleidoscope of Mediterranean goods encircle the ruined temple of Athena. 2 slender bridges connect Ortigia to mainland Siracusa, but in Oxford's time, you would need a ferry and a ferryman. 10 blocks uphill is the Neapolis Archaeological Park, with an enormous naturally acoustic cave, now known as Dionysius's Ear, named for the cruel tyrant whom Dante condemns to a boiling river of blood. Legend says Dionysius trapped his enemies in this cave and then eavesdropped on their secrets through the opening at the top. The cave abuts the largest Greek theater in the world, seating 15,000. But Errors wasn't the reason I wanted to see Siracusa. In April 1584, the Stationer's Register granted to John Lilly use of a play called Sappho and Phao, whose title page bore no author's name. The children and boys of St. Paul's, known as Oxford's Boys, had performed it at Blackfriars Theatre, which Oxford leased, and at court for the Queen in early March. It opens right here on Ortigia at the ferry to Siracusa. The goddess Venus, a stock reference to Queen Elizabeth, whose changeability and jealousy are mocked, hails, falls in love with, and makes fairest, the very fair young ferryman, Phao, who, like Oxford, can tell tales, has a proud heart, a disdaining mind, and will learn anything but dissembling. A flirty princess, named for the poetess Sappho, Vavasor, desires Phao, and he falls ludicrously in love with her. Jealous Venus crushes their romance because, as her love child Cupid reveals to Sappho, my mother is in love with Phao, and she willed me to strike you with disdain of him and he with desire of her. Cupid, who prefers Sappho's lap to his mother's, disobeys and causes Phao to worship Sappho, but to curse Venus. Sappho tells Venus that she is unworthy to be the lady of love and threatens to lead her in chains like a captive. Inside her roomy cave, the oracle Sibylla tells Theo to keep his ears open and his mouth shut. Venus assures Vulcan, Leicester, that she will love him again when she has either business or nothing else to do. Sappho's court is likened to the tree of the sun, whose root is fastened on knotted steel and top buds leaves of pure gold. Oxford was the knight of the tree of the sun. He was encased in steel armor, and it was actually decorated with pure gold leaves in the famous 1581 tilt at the height of his affair with Vavasour. References abound to Sicily's volcanic rock and hot climate. Theo ends the play, "Farewell, Siracusa, unworthy to harbor faith." Lilly never traveled to Sicily, but he was Oxford's secretary and Blackfriars Theatre manager. If you still believe Lilly wrote this play, how did he keep his head after embarrassing and insulting his monarch while praising her cheeky rival who threatened to lead her queen in chains like a captive? Agrigento, the Valley of Temples, is visible from the sea. Rowe didn't mention it, although it's Sicily's largest archaeology site, boasting 8 monumental temples, an Appian-like way, houses, agorae, and catacombs. In the 1st century BCE, when Rome's population was 800,000, Agrigento held 200,000, the same size as Elizabethan London. Others have speculated that Oxford visited Rome, but risking identification there would have been foolish, if not deadly. Oxford had already made considerable efforts to avoid the Papal States. Was Agrigento, with its unencumbered by an early modern city, the bard's model for ancient Rome in the Roman plays? It was, Rich agreed, a distinct possibility. Well, 14 years after Oxford returned to England, Edward Webb, a master gunner, wrote that he had seen Oxford personally make an open challenge to joust at Palermo. Webb also claimed to have played with unicorns and elephants as with young lambs, seen 4-headed beasts, and survived 18 years as a galley slave. So take Webb's testimony as you will. Whoever he was, Webb wrote during Oxford's lifetime, unlike the Commedia dell'arte librettist Andrea Parucci, who over 100 years later took Webb's testimony about Oxford's Italian fame and concocted the 1699 farcical Tirata del Giostra, literally a merry-go-round tirade, in which Oxford and others tilt before the fictional emperor Polydor. So, what in Palermo is actually in the plays? Rich asked. Well, Pandosto's abandoned daughter grows up as a shepherdess in the Palermo countryside, amid cedars, Alpia, which is a flowering Mediterranean grass, and Anita, which is a sun-loving tropical plant. Obviously, Robert Greene knew his Sicilian flora. In Winter's Tale, with its 6 verilies in 20 lines in Act 1, and references to 3 daughters, whose ages align closely with Oxford's own, Pandosto's Mediterranean plants have become English daffodils, violets, and oxlips. Rowe argued that the bard knew well the unique layout of Palermo's harbor and postern gates. But Pandosto contains the identical description of the Bohemian harbor and postern gates. Winter's Tale actually mentions nothing unique to Palermo, nor about Palermo's Palazzo Normanni, where the play begins and ends. Its renowned state apartments and Palatine Chapel are a mixture of Byzantine, Norman, and Fatimid architecture, covered floor to ceiling with extraordinary mosaics of semi-precious stones and gold. Rowe called it Leonti's Palace, but it was obvious to me that the bard never entered it. Carlo de Aragona Tagliavia, Viceroy of Sicily in 1575, would not have invited either the Earl of Oxford or some unknown English traveler into the government's Palazzo Normanni, nor would Oxford have been foolish enough to go. Whether Oxford was in Palermo is a sea of conjecture. While Palermo survived the plague better than other cities, I confess reluctantly to Rich that I put little faith in Webb or any of Rowe's Palermo conclusions. But then there was Vulcano. The Tempest backstory begins in Milan. A treacherous brother, Robert Cecil, hurried Duke Prospero with his daughter Miranda, Susan, from the Sforza Palace at midnight onto a bark, or barchiello in Italian, which took them some leagues to the sea, a voyage feasible from the Pavese Canal to the Tyrrhenian Sea. With fortuitous provisions, including mine own library, with volumes that I prize above my dukedom, they floated down Italy's west coast to Vulcano in the Aeolian Islands, just north of Sicily. Aeneas, loving and leaving Queen Dido in Carthage, sailed by Vulcano, but Virgil seems to have known it well. Book 8 of the Aeneid sets Vulcan's forge there, with geographically accurate descriptions of the island's volcanic smoking, hissing, and internal hammering. The bard starts hammering that the Tempest is set on Vulcano and nowhere else by opening the play, just like the Aeneid, with a tempest at sea, in open water, with Sicily just out of sight astern. The bard's shipwrecked Italian noblemen banter about recently attending the new Queen of Tunis's wedding, a short sail from Vulcano across the Strait of Sicily. The bard then pounds 16 times on Tunis, Dido, Aeneas, and Carthage until we get the message. When I read this passage to Rich, he said, how Stratfordians place this play on Bermuda or in the Caribbean is beyond me. Yes. If they read history or the Aeneid, they would know that Tunis is Carthage because it was built with Carthage's stones. We reached Vulcano via the high-speed ferry from Milazzo, predictably in a tempest. Above Vulcano's dock looms a promontory housing an enormous multi-chambered cavern. Closed now for security reasons, these 19th century drawings illustrate its cathedral-like interior, a full, poor cell that would well house a Milanese duke or an English earl and his precious books for a while. Adjacent to the cave and the harbor on yellow sands, just as Ariel says, are stinking sulfurous pools. These filthily mantled pools beyond your cell. It's really important to realize that the physical proximity of the pools to the cave is exact. Are where Ariel left the drunk butler and jester and Caliban, soaking like Vulcano's modern tourists up to the chins. Like the bard says, the pools smell like horse piss. The sulfuric gas hisses through the rocks. Internally, Vulcano is a maze of pathways through toothed briars, sharp furzes, prickling gorse and thorns, which enter your frail shins if you aren't careful. Its hard rock, bogs, fens, barren places, and fertile support a wide variety of flora and fauna, fields of wildflowers, mulberries, oak trees, acorns, and wild goats on its steep seaside cliffs. I can't swear to the hedgehogs. A well-known Protestant earl seeking to avoid papal and Spanish authority, other Englishmen, pirates, and the plague might well seek a remote, uninhabited island that seems odoriferously inhospitable at first, but that actually contains a natural harbor, freshwater springs, ready shelter, plenty of firewood, even if he had to carry it himself, wild game, fish, and a wide variety of edible plants, nuts, and gorgeous scenery. And that would be Vulcano. The large caldera at the island's center had last erupted in 1550, which kept the island uninhabited in 1575. But there was volcanic activity until about 1600 on the odd angle of the isle, where Ariel left the Neapolitan prince, Ferdinand. Il cratere della Fossa, the island's center-live volcano, offers stunning views from the rim, including of Stromboli puffing away. Rich and I hired a small boat to circumnavigate all 15 miles of Vulcano's coastline, including a large sea cave accessible only by boat on the far side. Rowe's deep nook where Ariel left the ship safely in harbor. Rowe did not mention that in The Tempest, the inebriated Stefano and Trinculo hammer on the word monster to describe Caliban 38 times. Shallow, very weak, poor, credulous, perfidious, drunken, puppy-headed, scurvy, abominable, ridiculous, howling, ignorant, drunken, brave. Are these drunks hallucinating? In 183 AD, Posidonio Rodio described how Vulcano's molten lava met cold salt waves, resulting in fire, clouds of steam, and these enormous natural black volcanic rock formations. They stand like frozen drunken revelers in an area called Valle dei Mostri, or Valley of the Monsters. Rowe did not discuss this amazing spot. Set amid the gorse, mulberry bushes, and red sand, we stumbled across it on a hike by chance, or perhaps Ariel led us there. Rich silently turned around amid the monsters, examining each. And finally he said, "How could anyone imagine that this place could exist and then write about it so accurately?" Okay, you win. Oxford is more likely than anyone to be Shakespeare. The day after Perrette reported Oxford's return to Venice, Oxford wrote Burleigh for the first time in over 6 months. He asked for license to travel in Germany the next summer because he had been hindered from a great deal of travel. He was glad to have seen Italy, but cared not ever to see it anymore. Weak from a fever, sunburnt, lucky to be alive, injured, not kidnapped, and not imprisoned, Oxford had survived a rough passage around the Italian peninsula. In a prior lecture, I demonstrated that Oxford was not a monstrous husband. I hope you are now convinced he was not on a pleasure cruise or a grand tour, heedlessly spending money as others have claimed. Rather, while on a diplomatic mission far from home, during a life-threatening pandemic, Oxford took rational action to stay alive when his identity and religion severely limited his options. He memorialized his unique voyage from Venice to Genoa in the barred southern Italian plays, unmistakably signing them with his footprints in the sandy coasts of Illyria and Sicily. Thank you for listening.